all sorted out. Very good to be here as part of this conference, and just to explain any confusion about which organisation I'm with, I'm representing the School of Oriental and African Studies, and our programme actually had its background and history in first of all Y College and then Imperial College, and was transferred to SOAS from August this year. So I'm going to be talking about reconnecting with mobile learners in Africa. And first of all, I want to actually go back in time in my own experience. So this is a bit of a connection with schools, primary and secondary, if you like. About 30 years ago, I was teaching in the west of Kenya in a school called Bumamu Secondary School. And this is some pictures of how it was at that time. As you see, it's a rural school, and there was quite a lot of students, about 200 students. I was very fortunate this year in July to be able to revisit the school, and this is how it is now. Basically, not a lot has changed, and this is setting the scene, if you like, for things that will follow in my presentation, where I'm going to be referring quite a lot to the context. The library, top left, still had the 100 or so books that we managed to get from the UK, I think, 30 years ago. The classrooms were, it was just a real throwback. I'd go to the back of the classroom and I'd find these tiny bits of chalk, and these would always be thrown by the teachers to wake people up, I'm told. But I always used to be looking for these tiny bits of chalk because it was the only chalk available to use to write on the blackboard. And it really hasn't changed. In fact, if anything, it's gone backwards. The communication by road has become more difficult. The matatu, the taxi drivers, don't go there because of some politics and bribery. There are less students, and the whole place is looking more dilapidated. So, just moving on in my own life, I then later on worked in a university in Katmandu in Nepal, and just a short aside on that, because around about this time of year, October I think it was, I'd been there about 3 weeks, and it was Diwali, and I was involved in teaching a class, and about sort of 20 minutes into the class the door was open, and I didn't know what was happening, but suddenly there was this gigantic explosion about 1 yard in front of me, and this firecracker had gone off, and basically I couldn't hear anything for about 2 weeks. Well, sorry, no, 2 minutes. But it was around about then that I started thinking about the advantages of distance learning. So we're going to be talking about distance learning in the context of postgraduate education now. And first off, I want to just briefly introduce a few things about the program. I've already explained the organizational context. It's a global distance learning program focused on postgraduates. There are degrees offered in subjects like sustainable development, agricultural economics, and the students are in over 100 different countries. Many of them are based in rural areas. Many of them travel a lot as part of their work. They're typically mid-career, so they are working, and typically sort of between the ages of about 30 and 45. Good gender balance, and very diverse access in relation to ICTs, and I'll come back to that a bit more as we move on. What we've tried to do, and what I'm responsible for in my role, is developing the educational model, which several years ago was very much based on print-based study guides that would be sent out to the students, and then submission of assignments by post, and then later on by email. The context, I think, is incredibly important to understand when you're thinking about distance learning and how mobile technologies might help. These are some just mix of photos from Nepal, and I neglected to say that when I was in Katmandu, I decided to embark on a distance learning course myself. And the kind of experiences you have as a learner are quite interesting to reflect on. It was when the power was off that I often studied, and it was often by candlelight. It was when I was on a long journey from one end of the country to another on the bus that I'd take my big study guide, and it was really quite heavy stuff, with me, and study on the bus. because I was working full-time. Exams were often disturbed by festivals, closures, and political instability. So getting into this project, the context was Southern Africa, and we got interested in it because the University of Pretoria had been looking at a teacher's education program and noted that of a couple of thousand students they had on that program, about 5% had internet access, but 95% had mobile phones. Now, we had a collaboration going with the University of Pretoria, so we embarked on a project in relation to our own students in what's called the SADC region, the Southern African Development Community, which is a number of different countries, including Malawi and Tanzania, and we have students in most of those countries. The project was funded by the university, and I've already mentioned the student profile, but we wanted to move to the next stage, not looking at what could be done with text messaging or voice, but what we could do with the latest kind of models of mobile phones that were available. And you might think that that's inappropriate, but I'll come back to explain why we did that later on. Just a little bit more on the African context. Picture of electricity, where you find the power, and it's obviously more around the coastal regions and in South Africa and West Africa. Otherwise, it's a big problem still. Internet, similarly, tends to sort of be being developed in certain centres and around the continent, but your average person where they're working will find it's often a 2 or 3 hour journey at best to some internet cafe in order to be able to communicate using internet. By contrast, and obviously there's limited access to landline phones, GSM coverage and phone coverage in terms of infrastructure has been growing rapidly, and you've probably heard reports of that. So that was very interesting to us. Part of our goals for the project were really to improve access to learning, because all these different technologies were advancing, and some students in the UK and other parts of the world were benefiting from them. But in Africa, our students weren't really in touch with us or using the same kind of educational resources. So those are some of the goals. I'm going to sort of skip through because there's things I want to touch on in perhaps a little bit more detail. But we really wanted to see how we could reconnect and build in new ways with our learners in Africa. So first of all, we did a sort of baseline survey and looked at the literature projects, and we got 4 students, 2 in Malawi and 2 in Tanzania, to start to work with us and identify what they thought could be done. And they were responsible for identifying the kind of phone that they felt would be useful, and referring to it as a phone rather than a mobile technology is probably misleading anyway, because it was the other uses that were starting to interest them in terms of the video and camera and sound recording and so forth. Tanzania and Malawi, those maps on the right are just giving you an illustration of the kind of coverage that was 2 years ago now. So around most of the major routes again and the major cities, there was quite significant access. Power and price were an issue, but ICT literacy was also something we were wondering about. We were wondering whether people would be able to pick up and use these different features of these devices, or whether there'd be a lot of support requirements. But what we also noticed within these contexts was that mobiles were being used creatively outside of the sort of educational sphere, in the context of transferring money, communicating with families in the villages and so forth. So the students started to come up with ideas as to what we might do, and they focused on the audio-visual aspects, the possibility of contact with their tutors, being able to study while moving and working in the field, and using these devices for research. A number of issues which arise, but I won't go into now, but anyone can talk to me about later. But we were putting this in the context of a lot of work that had already been done in relation to e-learning, if I can put it broadly. And we had to say, where does this fit with what else we're doing? ICT literacy of the group of students we surveyed was actually very good. Most of them studied at home or in the office. Very few of them actually managed to study while they were traveling. Yet, interestingly enough, most of them spent at least a month or often more than 3 months traveling in the field. So there's sort of severe disruptions to their study. And really, e-learning wasn't very effective for that group of students. They were more disconnected than many of our students in other parts of the world. So we started looking at the potential, and the students themselves identified the kind of technology, and we very rapidly saw that the potential was through the multifunctionality of the device, if you like, and what could be achieved by just having one device rather than maybe several different things for sound recording, video, and all the cables you need to cart around with you. The students themselves were telling us that the last thing that they left behind when they travelled was their mobile phone. So this was something very personal and perhaps very appropriate to see if we could build on for learning. I'll sort of fly through this part. In a way it's very important, but the experience initially of most of our students is they're studying in a very isolated context. What we saw as the potential of this project was for the students to start to collaborate more. Those who used our online learning environment and the internet already had that, but those in the African context were disenfranchised, if you like. And we hope that with the potential of this device, they would be reconnected and re-engaged with a community of learners in new ways. We focused on 2 particular courses and how we might develop content in addition to what was available in print and on interactive CDs. And the students themselves helped us a lot to understand what they feel was the added value of this. The type of subject matter involved actually is very significant, as we found, and our courses are very much focused on social sciences, so it's quite difficult sometimes to see what can be done. But we had one course which was actually focused on information communication, technology and development. And here we looked at how the device itself could be creatively used for new types of activities. And some of that was actually really interesting in terms of what they produced and shared back with us. By contrast, our rural development module was more of a story in itself, so people asked for sort of audio versions of the materials and videos that they could watch of their tutors and so on. Some of the things that people started to produce and share back with us, as I say, were very fascinating. Not really time to show or share everything, but this particular student, for instance, if I can get that to do anything for me. Maybe not now. Okay, so what I was going to try and illustrate there is that the student themselves had decided to use the mobile device to introduce herself, to interview other people she worked with, and there were some very interesting things shared back in terms of interviews that focused on UNDP projects in Iran and how Iran had used ICTs in response to an earthquake a few years ago. And these types of things just started to really open up our eyes about the possibilities of what could happen when 1,000 students in 100 different countries start to share the resources that they're creating with one another. And it actually creates a really powerful set of learning resources for the tutors to work around. And you know, it's a huge and valuable thing that can start to happen as people realize the quality and potential of the technologies they have. So the experience so far, just to sum up, we've seen that the context is changing very rapidly. We were very impressed by how quickly the students adopt the new sort of things that they can do on the phones that they had. And in particular, the use of multimedia was very evident, and this has got sort of huge potential for how we design and develop our course materials in the future. So in a sense, it's driving us back to think about how multimedia could be used more. We did have certain technical problems with the phones and the gadgets, and I think one of the big issues at the moment, obviously, is the infrastructure. It's okay for making local calls, you can afford that, but actually transferring quite large files around the world is obviously impractical And a lot of the ways that they had to do it within the context of this pilot was to synchronize what they'd captured on their phone with the PC and then send it back to us as email attachments. So it's not practical to roll out and scale up in this way, obviously. But what we're seeing is that network coverage is increasing rapidly. Cost of the handsets, the N70 we used cost £300 when we got it 2 years ago, and I bought one yesterday for £85. Student skills in terms of ICTs and use of these devices is increasing rapidly, and the kind of capabilities for data storage, for audio, video, and so forth on the phones themselves is improving dramatically. So for our purposes, we wanted to find out what's interesting and what is possible now, so that the kind of investment we can make in supporting distance learners in the future is well prepared. Advice, just very briefly, is that I don't think that this necessarily, in terms of on-campus education, would be the same outcome. You've got different challenges. With distance learning, you're starting with good quality materials, and you're looking at how to extend access and reflect maybe pedagogic innovation. With the campus-based learning, you're starting with good teaching, and you want to share resources. So you're starting a bit from the other end. As I say, we think that there's quite a long lead time if you're dealing with something like distance learning, that you have to prepare in advance. And we hope that by the time we've got our materials prepared, the infrastructure and the costs for sharing data around will have come down dramatically. This is a whole other presentation, really, but my own reflections on this is that really, for the purposes of our program, we need to be almost putting the mobile learner at the center and thinking, what is the kind of learning environment and the way in which they engage in a user-friendly way with each other, with the tutors, and make best use of the technologies that are around them. And the fact that you can be anywhere, any place, and engage with, to varying degrees, what's on the internet or what's possible within your own country is quite significant. And the social software that's being developed that can run on mobile devices is also a big area for us to think about further. So just to conclude then, we've got an evaluation of the project, and we'll get more student responses at the end of this year. And then next year we're going to look at how we scale up to something that is more sustainable and practical, and that works with the kind of phones that most of the students have. We'll be looking at how we take the development of further modules forward, and maybe even seeing if we can sort of combine in some way with working with the private sector in Africa, so that we put the best technologies we can in the hands of the learner. So, coming back to where I kind of started, we started with a print-based model in distance learning, and we've added on over the years audio and video, CDs, online learning environments, and I think that we've reached a point now where, having sort of had quite a major disconnect and a playing field that was very uneven, we've got something that lets us reconnect with our learners, and that is going to be very powerful for the future. I've finished, but as a final slide, I'll just sort of return to Bumamu, because one might ask in 30 years what's changed and how much difference does any of this really make in most of Africa. What I noticed also when I went back was that two things were emerging. First off, there was cell phone coverage. They were cutting down trees next to the house of one of the teachers, because electricity was finally coming to the school. There was a Kenyan volunteer teacher, as opposed to me, who was a UK-based volunteer teacher. But many people don't really stay there very long unless they got some sort of professional support. So I think there's interesting things that may be ahead for Bumamu now, because they too can maybe benefit from some of the sort of connection with the outside world. Perhaps there's a school here that would like to link with them in some way, and perhaps some of what I've said might relate to those who are interested in links between schools in the UK and Africa, because I think some of what we've been trying to experiment with in terms of distance learning is relevant in those kind of partnerships and relationships as well. I'm going to stop now, and whether this works or not, I don't know, but it might be a bit of a bit of music to end on.